Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to start a series on material resource planning. In that series we're going to discuss things like the MRP workbench, the supply and demand of an item, and how that impacts your plan for production. So first you have to have the material planner responsibility, and let's go down and let's look at our MRP workbench. We have several plans available to us. I've already looked into this one. It has some data that we can find that is relevant, so we're going to open this plan. And as with most planners, when they're coming in the morning and they're determining what they need to work on during the day, the first thing they're going to look at is the exceptions data. So we can come down to exceptions, and we could put in a value here to reduce our exceptions, but in some cases you just want to see everything that's available. So in that case you would just hit the find button. And the orders we're interested in, or the exceptions that we're interested in, are things like past due sales orders, orders with compression days, orders to be rescheduled, and of course items with a shortage. So let's start with maybe our past due sales orders, or our past due orders. Have a look at those. So by checking the box, you're selecting this line, and you can go into your exception details. Here's all the different items that have past due orders. And as we see over here, it looks like we've got situations where you've got a PO that hasn't been received. You've got a PO that's been received but not delivered. So let's just select the first one here and go into our horizontal material plan. Alright, now in this plan we see that we're set up on daily buckets, and not everybody wants to be on daily buckets. So I'm going to go up to my tools menu, go into preferences, I'm going to change that out to weeks. And I could also change out a few other things. If I didn't want to see things that were in transit, I could take out my in transit selections, payback supply, and that looks pretty good. Most everything else I really care to see, so I'm gonna take out payback demand as well. So I'm going to apply that, and if this is something I want to keep and use later on in my workbenches, I can go ahead and save it as well. If I decide I didn't want it, I want to go back to my default settings, I could reset it. Alright, so let's see, what did it change for us over here? So it took out a few things that we didn't want to see. Okay, so for this given item, we can see we have purchase orders of 30. We have 11 in receiving, which gives us a total supply of 41. Now we see that there's no demand. There's no gross requirements, there's no forecast, and there's no sales orders. So this is interesting. So our beginning on hand is 0. Our projected available balance is 41. Projected on hand is 41. That's if we do the receipts of the 30 and the 11, but those have not been done yet. So that's why they're considered past due. So in order to get this material in, you've got to do some standard receipts. Alright, so that's an interesting one. you want to go back to your workbench, back to your exception summary, close those two forms, and let's look at orders to be rescheduled out. Have a look at those. So we're going to select this item, and again we're going to go to our material plan, but before we do, you can see that basically we've got a PO and a discrete job that are bringing in supply. So let's actually, the discrete job is bringing, let's see if that's supply or demand. Okay, so we've got, okay, the forecast is actually calling for the demand. So we have our gross requirements is totally forecast. We have WIP requirements of 100, so that was demand that we saw in that previous screen. We have a total supply of 100. So that leaves us with a beginning on hand of 120. And okay, so yeah, that was demand from WIP. So it's taking out the 100 that would go to the WIP job, and that leaves us with a balance of 20. And we've got some scheduled receipts out there. So our projected on hand for this week is 22. For next week, we have a negative. And the reason for that negative, if we come up here, we see that we have a forecast for 400. So that demand for that week is driving our projected on hand negative. So you can work out using your horizontal plan how these exceptions affect your production process. Items with excess inventory is usually a situation where you have no demand, and we see there is no demand, yet we have a balance of 25. And you can have that quite often. Sometimes you have inventory that's just sitting around, not doing any good, and it's not selling. So when you have a situation like that, you take advantage of either scrapping that inventory or depreciating it down with some accounting processes, or if it's material that you just need to save for a later date, then you can just keep it in inventory and just ignore that exception. Items with shortage, that's kind of a critical situation. If you go into the exception details and look at these items, they have a shortage, and that shortage is reflected here. So we have a planned order for 1, and our beginning on hand is -1. So it's saying that we're short on this particular component. So this is just an example of how you would handle some of the exceptions. Another situation which is very similar to excess inventory are items with no activity. You may not have any on hand, but basically the system's telling you that there's no supply or demand for this item. So if we look at one of those items and go into our plan, we see there's a lot of zeros. We have no on hand, no demand that's going out, no supply that's coming in, and it looks to be that way for several weeks. So this is a good candidate for items that you may need to inactivate because they're no longer in use, certainly from your production perspective. Alright, so that's kind of the first in the series of how we would handle exceptions, and I'm going to be working on some other lessons which will show us how to release planned orders and do some more activities on the workbench. So that concludes this session, and thank you.